We might as well do introductions as far as, so a little bit on your background. Like, why are you having this conversation with me? Where did you come from? I know you moved from New York to come here to Greene County.
Yeah.
But, introduce yourself.
Yeah.
And it's all right if you brag.
Right. I've always been a kid of nature.
Yeah.
My dad was a Franciscan monk, and he raised us on a homesteading farm, and so I really got into birds and plants really early, and so then over time I always thought I'd move to Brazil or something like that, because it's like the heart of the issue you think when you're a kid. But then I went to school for natural resources.
But it's going somewhere else, you're saying, to help them out.
The problem.
To where the problems are.
Yeah, exactly.
You don't see the problems as close to home.
Right. And then, after I went to school, I got a job doing Restoration Ecology, which was just outside of Broadhead here in Greene County. But it was a huge operation. We were doing restoration in Kansas and Chicago and Minnesota and all Appleton and Madison and Milwaukee. And that was the start of...
And who were you working with?
It was called Applied Ecological Services at the time. And then they eventually were sold just a few years ago to Resource Environmental Solutions, it's just a huge market now. Using native plants to restore habitat for the benefit of water retention. Mm-hmm. I mean, they're using them for a whole development, instead of using wastewater or sewage drainage systems, they're using native plants and bioswales. But that's happening all over the country. You're talking about resiliency. You think about St. Louis, for instance. They put up a big wall to stop the influx of water coming in from hurricanes. But in reality, that was a huge swamp that was taking that water in long before
they built the city there.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, trying to think, restoration ecology is about trying to think about how to use it, or at least Applied Ecological Services' goal was to utilize natural systems to really rectify some of these, more terrible problems and creating solutions that are simpler, cheaper, and more effective than wastewater retention systems.
Than these high input systems that take tons of maintenance and everything.
Yeah. So then I decided that I didn't really like being on the road all the time, so I started working for the nursery. I became a wild seed collector throughout the Midwest, and that just opened my eyes to diversity, the species diversity, and what we see here, in our backyards is really not even close to what is out there in terms of the really interesting species.
What is out there, and also what was.
Exactly. It's a sad... Right. It's a sad viewpoint when you start to look at it closely.
But hopeful if you look at what could be.
Exactly. For sure.
But so what was your degree then?
Natural Resources Management.
Okay.
Basically forestry, surveying, water quality, things like that.
And what did you do in New York before?
So that brought me to... I traveled to Kansas.
I see. And
was helping out with restoration projects there, and then I moved to Albany, New York to do a big landfill restoration. And then I got this opportunity to seed collect for the National Forest Service and New York City Parks, because New York City actually has, around that area, has a really interesting slate of species, because it's a culmination of that growing zone is similar to Virginia, but it also has all these different geological oddities that leads it to have insane tree diversity, shrub diversity.
It just happens
plant
that there's a
diversity.
big old city sitting there.
Exactly. Yeah. So I went there to do that, and then I was offered a job to run New York City's native plant nursery. Which, so in that time frame, I'm thinking about biology and biodiversity, and what I'm coming to realize is that restoration ecology feels a lot like building a museum because you're always putting these, even if you're doing an 800-acre restoration, you're putting it in the midst of this whole ecologically kind of broken system. You know, when you talk about agriculture and cities and everything like that, you're talking about a really broken system. We're talking about creating islands of biodiverse ecosystems within an ocean of really dilapidated ecology. And so it's very important to do that, to create those islands, because you're offering up refuge for native birds, bugs, and the like. Right. But you start to feel like, what am I doing? Why am I wasting?
Well, it's not enough to offset the impact of the humans all around.
Yeah.
It's not really. That goes out to the farming world.
Right.
So, what's a good description of restoration ecology? So someone's never heard the term before.
Right. Yeah. I mean, within the United States, there was probably 5,000 native species of plants, trees, shrubs, ferns, cactuses, whatever, or more. And what you try to do in native restoration is kind of start with a clean slate and get as many of those species out there and active in that living system as possible, which in turn brings back huge amounts of biodiversity in terms of birds, bugs, microbiology, the list goes on and on. And also, when you're thinking about restoration ecology, you're thinking about systems. So ecology is the study of the systems, or the biological systems. So when you think about biological systems, you're thinking about swamps that actually captured water, retained it, and cleaned it before it, sloughed it off and put it into river systems. Or the same goes for, upland grasslands and the list goes on and on. So it's using those native species, reintroducing that biodiversity, and then utilizing them for ecological systems,
The reason I wanted to have this discussion with you today is because obviously I'm a small farmer myself. I'm not an ecologist, other than the description of the word that, as a farmer, I'm doing my best to support growing biodiversity of the land as a regenerative, focused farmer.
Right.
Trying to get, primarily to get good food, sustainable food to people's plates. Obviously, my one farm is going to support a fraction of the food needs. But by duplicating, I'm not looking at getting massive, by duplicating what I'm doing, it's possible to feed the world. And we can go into more of that later. But I've talked to many people, I sell at the farmer's market and then I sell online, but I've talked to many people who would love to eat meat, would love to support farming, but they're not sure how they can do it. I talked to one girl who's like, I'm a vegetarian now, and I love meat, but I just can't reconcile the ethical dilemmas of what farming does. I mean, we all know what farming does. You look around us, we've lost, we're down to less than 1% organic matter in our topsoil from 10% and more. We've lost so many species. I mean, the list goes on and on and on and on.
For sure.
You just Google environmental impacts of farming and you can find everybody talking about how horrible it is for the environment, because truly what we're surrounded with, 90-95% of it is terrible for the environment.
Yeah.
So I totally get it when people do that.
Well, but I mean, you could say the same thing about fruit and vegetable production all over the world.
Right. Farming in general.
Yes.
Whether meat farming or whether vegetable farming or whether
Absolutely.
grain farming. I mean, most meat farming is supported by grain farming, but half of our corn goes to the ethanol industry, so that's just something completely different.
And meat production at this moment in our conventional agricultural system is extremely extractive. I mean, you're talking about 80% of the corn and soybeans going to our animals for that production.
Right.
And I
So
totally
we're using
agree
tons
with her
of land for that. Yeah.
in that regard. I think that, if you looked at even, I mean, you could look at the process of getting an avocado ready and shipped to your location and having that at your doorstep whenever you want. It's staggering the amount of.
Well, right, and the California water crisis. I mean, you look at people talk about how much water it takes to grow an almond, and I know a lot of people, when looking for protein and fat alternatives other than animal proteins, go to nuts. And a lot of our nut production, I mean, almonds is a big one.
And
it's just as extractive as anything else.
And the spray-centric, basically, I mean, when you look at all of this, all of agriculture right now is on this linear path. They're going towards single structured production, really trying to make as much profit out of a single acre as possible, as quickly as possible. And this is, the sustainability of it is it's impossible. I mean, if you think about losing a single sheet of paper of soil off of an acre of corn, you're talking about a ton of soil. 1 ton of soil is
From
a sheet
1 acre.
From 1 acre.
And that can happen in an
You could
hour of rainfall or less.
Yeah. And you're talking about, what are there? It's like 4 billion acres of grassland, or not acres, hectares of grassland. It's almost like 16 billion acres of grasslands in the world. And they're almost all have been used for agricultural. And what we lean towards now is single crop monoculture production that is green for 3 months out of the year, and the rest of the time it's either uncovered, or if it's covered minimally. So you're losing soil every year. I mean, that is not, in an ecological system, there's a gain of soil every year. In a healthy ecological system with healthy biodiversity, with all of the characters, what I mean by characters is having that. In a native grassland, you would have some species that have 15, 16-foot deep root systems, all the way to species that have a foot deep root systems. And the variability within that is so important. But
and why is that variability in
because
those multi-species and having the different root depths? What makes that important versus, just having corn in a field where it's all just the same?
Well, those root depths is directly correlated to carbon sequestration. Carbon being stored underground is the most stable place to put carbon. You can dig down a couple of meters and you'll find carbon from 100,000 years ago.
It's just sitting down there.
It's just sitting there.
So what happens then when you plow it?
That's the exact opposite of what you want to do. It's the release of all of this excess carbon that's sitting in the soil. If every time you till, you can't, you're gonna lose carbon into the atmosphere. Carbon dioxide is gonna come from that. All of the different problems that we're seeing in terms of ocean acidification, all of that is coming from, well, not all of it, but a huge portion of that is coming from our agricultural systems.
Right.
We can't...
And we know there's lots of things that cause damage to the environment, but I think, like many of my customers and people I've talked to, as well as many people in ethical studies who do care about the planet and have kind of opened their eyes to how damaging farming at large is, realize like this kind of, what would you say the impact of our fossil fuel burning on the highway from our cars with their emission systems and stuff versus just what the Midwest, but like it's a drop in the bucket. Fossil fuels do contribute to carbon in the atmosphere, but it is almost nothing.
Well,
compared to,
I would say I'm not the expert on
right.
that, but I would say that when you look at when you think about natural resources management, you think about when you're thinking about pollution, you're thinking about point source pollution and non-point source pollution. Non-point source pollution is very hard to measure, and point source pollution is easy to measure.
And point source pollution, describe the difference between the two.
It would be like, say, waste or a paper mill is creating all this sludge that comes out of their systems, and they're dumping that directly into the river. You can measure that pipe,
correct,
right? But if you take a field like this, one of these cornfields, and have a huge rain event, and or till it or spray it with a whole bunch of Roundup, and whatever's washing off of that, or
that does
especially
not get measured.
nitrogen, non-inorganic nitrogen, it's very hard to measure the effects of that. We can measure them. We can have a good idea of what the problem that is causing, but it's way more difficult to get those answers. So when you're thinking about like this whole ecological system, which North America, 400 years ago, 15,000 years ago, as an ecological system, you kind of have to look at the parts that made that ecological system, that made it so healthy and robust. Because if you went to my parents' place in Greene County, Wisconsin, 400 years ago, you would have been able to tap into like an 8-foot or 4-foot deep, rich, black, beautiful soil that was there because of these grasslands, because of these grazers, because of this whole ecological system that's continually building itself.
So what role do those grazers being, before we came here, before people, it was buffalo, they were here in Wisconsin, right?
So that's...
They were probably everywhere, but what other grazers did we have in this area? Like what did, I guess going back, what did, before farmers came to the Midwest? There were hunter-gatherers for who knows how long. But
20,000 years.
But I'm saying before modern farming, if you can call it modern farming, it's been going on. Tilling has been going on for a long time too. But came to the Midwest. What did it look like here, say in Greene County, like from your research or?
Sure. Yeah, if you would have looked at the lower wet areas, you would have had tree-dominated, shrub-dominated, forb-dominated wetlands we would have had, and you're talking about sedges, grasses, flowers, of all different kinds and species, as well as in the upper uplands, you would have got more into fire habitat, which would have been bur oaks, white oaks, would have been red oaks, and then the understory, the forb layer and the shrub layer, would have been immensely diverse. You would have had things like compass plant and cup plant and all the asters, 100 species of asters, 20 species of milkweeds, 130 species of sedges, and probably over 200 species of grasses. You're talking about, and all of them playing different niche roles within an ecosystem. And amongst that, you would have had grazing herds. If you really look at Wisconsin, you could say, 15,000 years ago it was covered in ice. Right? But after that, Native Americans came through, and Native Americans also had an effect on the grazing communities. If you really look at it, about the time Native Americans showed up here, the mammoth disappeared, and the
Okay.
mastodon disappeared, and the giant buffalo, the bison antiquus, disappeared at that same time. These are all, as well as the two species
Just
of
curious.
giant bears and
So I'm just
massive
curious,
stag.
how big are these giant bears?
They're almost twice as big as the grizzly bear.
Well, I mean, I guess there had to be
And
a predator.
more aggressive. It's six
That's why
species
that's
of
why people didn't live here.
right. 6 species of lion, you know? This is a huge
Yeah.
you can't even imagine the complexity of that ecological system. And what's happening is that the thing about grazers, and the interesting thing about grazers, and this is why I moved back to Greene County, and this is why I believe in this grazing system, is because grazers are actually hugely useful in terms of building soil. So if you take a grassy meadow and you see it with conventional agriculture all the time, where they just put their animals out there. They might have 2 to 4 paddocks, and they're putting them out there for a month at a time. What's happening is that you lose biodiversity incrementally over time, and you compact your soil incrementally over time. Say you take that.
And let's just pause there and just why does conventional grazing? Because that's a point. One of the reasons I got in mind to have this discussion was because one of my customers sent me an article from The Guardian that the headline was that the most damaging stuff, damaging things to the environment, or the most damaging farm products is organic pasture-fed beef and lamb. And he goes on to the article to talk about how horrible grazing is. He mixes just pasture, kind of lumps together all things pasture-raised as one thing, and discusses regenerative ag as just a rebranding of pasture. So why does, because we know, obviously, we can look at tilling and spraying when we discuss some of these things, why that's damaging. Why is just turning your animals out into the pasture, which is, I don't know, what would you say, 90-95% or more of how animals on the land are treated? They're just put out there it's called continuous grazing. They're on the land. So that's grazing. That's pasture fed. Sounds nice, right? You've got grazing animals.
For sure.
But what is the difference between that versus say what the grazers were before, or what we're trying to do? Okay, first of all, just how does that damage?
Right. Well, I mean,
with plant growth and continuous grazing, how does that take the species away, reduce root depth, all that good stuff? Yeah,
I mean that's the basis of neglect. You know, if you put one animal out over 10 acres and you leave them on that 10 acres for years, what's going to slowly happen is that animal's going to go to its favorite species every chance that species comes up and grows a little bit. They're going to eat that off, and then eventually that species is going to die.
Okay.
And then slowly, over time, you're going to continue to lose species, their favorite species over time. And not just their favorite species, but what they need.
Okay.
So each one of these species has the potential to bring up minerals, nutrients, and value to the animal that can help satiate it, deworm it, do all of those different things. So as you lose those species, this animal can destroy a 10-acre parcel.
One animal. It doesn't matter. I mean, it's not high stocking density, but it can still destroy it.
But you could put 5,000 animals on that same 10 acres for one day and then leave that paddock rest. It will not kill a single plant on that part. As a matter of fact, it will probably engage more diversity, because what they're doing is in restoration ecology youth, if you want to engage diversity, you have to, you seed, you get more species of seed out there, and then you mow it. You mow it for the first year, and then the
That's
second
to get
year,
light down to the soil to get these new species that you
Exactly.
added a little bit of sunlight so they
Exactly.
can grow.
it's as simple as that.
To get them established.
But beyond that, you take those 10,000 animals and you put it over that 10 or 5,000 animals, put it over that 10 acres for one day. The other thing that they're doing is they're trampling all of this material. And anybody who's a gardener knows that if you add compost to your soil, it's going to build your soil. So the interesting thing about grass, and you can see it after you run animals over an area tightly, they trample a good majority of that
They
grass.
eat some, but they trample a
Yes.
lot of it, right?
And that grass lays down and the stuff on the bottom is not able to get any sun anymore, so the plant sloughs it off. And then it turns into compost. It turns into another
Which is
biological.
organic matter in the
Exactly.
soil, full of carbon and
Yes, exactly.
all kinds of nutrients, and your soil just adds a layer rather than taking it off.
Exactly.
So, in a pasture, my understanding in a pasture, where you're continuous grazing, I've seen recommendations, you have to renovate your pasture every, 3 to 4 years. And what does pasture renovation mean?
Right.
You go in with your tractor, you till it up. Often, there's some no-till practices around, but you till it up and you replant. If you're lucky, 3 to 4 species of grass,
Right.
and maybe some legumes in there.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because the animals have taken everything that's good.
Right.
Okay, so now you've got feed for your animals again. But you do a soil sample, and, you mentioned that there's species missing, so you don't have the minerals in there. So you take a soil sample, and you're deficient in all these minerals. It used to not be that way. It's increasing every year. We have to add more and more. Farmers are having to add more and more. So you do, and so you add your minerals, you add your seed, and guess what? You've got a beautiful pasture again. The animals are happy, and then it degrades over the next 2 years, and you add more. So you're adding and adding and adding. Okay, and if you're grazing and then leaving it to rest, like you were describing, that is what's adding to the soil right there. Like you're adding the species, you're adding it's drastic. So they're both grazing.
Right.
But what happens is a drastically different effect
Totally.
on the soil. And you can't lump it together as pasture fed can mean a world of different things. Just putting animals in the pasture, you can either have something that is,
Yeah.
because an overgrazed pasture, which is what 90+% of the pastures are here in Greene County, are overgrazed. They run off water. They're almost like concrete. If we get a rain, like it's pouring rain outside right now, it'll run off.
Yeah.
So guess what happens when it gets dry the next week? It just dries off. You don't have any water retention.
Well,
If your grass is either trampled down or let to grow high, that water stays. And there's studies that show how much
Retention.
water retention per percent soil organic matter. Do you have any of those numbers?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
That'd be interesting. So what can if I add 1%? So we've lost 8 to 10% of the organic matter in Greene County or whatever in the soil. So if we add that back, which we can, there's case studies and farms who are doing it, and now there's studies, good studies being done on it as well. But once again, it's harder to measure this type of stuff, so that's why there's been a drought of good studies on it. But if you're adding back, Gabe Brown has done this in North Dakota, but so a percent of organic matter, how much more water can?
Oh yeah, I'm not exactly sure.
The number.
It's insane the difference though. If you're talking about 8% organic matter versus a 0.5% or 1%,
It's millions of gallons.
The ability to retain water, like a 1-inch rain event, or let's say, right now what we're starting to see is that we have 25-year rain events, 50-year rain events, and that's how they calculate. So every 100 years you might get one rain event with 12 inches of rain in 5 hours or whatever, and that's a 100-year rain event. What they're seeing on some of these soils is that when they originally start, they're getting about 1 inch of percolation into the ground per hour, right?
So that means The ground can handle about an inch
And
of rain
everything
before
else
everything
is-
else runs
It's
off.
sloughing
Right.
off. After they get, up to 5% organic matter, some of these guys are able to retain 12 to 20 inches of
Rain an hour stays
hour.
in the soil rather than running off.
And stays in the soil. And this is super important because when you talk about resiliency on a land, on an ecosystem scale, if water can be retained in deep pockets and held right there, then you have long-term resiliency even into major drought. Gabe Brown talks about how North Dakota has been in a 5-year drought, which, is probably partly due to all of our environmental issues, but he's showing that he can plant cover crops into his September harvested corn right after it's harvested, and I'm just making it, but he's getting germination with no rain.
Because he has so much moisture in the soil.
That's right.
And Gabe Brown, for people who don't know, he doesn't till, so he raises crops on thousands of acres.
And animals.
and grazes animals, and he does not till and does not use chemicals, and his production rivals the neighbors that are putting hundreds of thousands of dollars into their farms just to keep them alive.
Yeah.
And that's by strategic use of cover crops.
With no government subsidies.
Right, with no government. That's another unique. There aren't government subsidies for much of this regenerative ag.
And he's building organic matter every year. So
even with government subsidies, he was losing his farm. I mean, if you read his story, Dirt to Soil is his book. That is an amazing book.
Yeah.
But he was losing the farm, and when he changed his practices, it's growing beyond his wildest dreams. He's added, he's up to 10 to 15% organic matter on some places of his farm from less than 1%. Has huge ecological benefits, and that's without chemicals and without tilling.
Right.
Minimal equipment usage and
animal
and
impact.
using animal impact in conjunction. There's more to that we won't be able to get into today, but
so it's fascinating when you you can take this article and he points to 100 studies that were all synthesized to point to the fact that grazing, especially organic grazing, has negative impacts on the land. And absolutely, most organic grazing does have negative impacts on the land.
There's nothing...
This operation was organic when I got here. And
I know this farm. I drove past it all the time. It was hard pan and thistles.
It was just the hardest soil. And already we have conglomerate organic, where the soil is starting to look like cottage cheese almost. So there's a lot more.
It's in water now. It doesn't just run off. In just a couple years, you've been managing it.
Yeah. And so when the other thing this gentleman is talking about is biodiversity loss, right? So biodiversity is really that's why I came here to Wisconsin, was to really start to work on this idea of how you can engage biodiversity through grazing on an ecological and economical scale, right? So that's the ideal, right? What they're learning is through good grazing and management practices that you're engaging biodiversity, but they're also learning that good animal health is due to that biodiversity. So rest, recovery, and intensive movement, they call it AMP grazing, or adaptive multi-paddock grazing operations, where you're adaptively, so say for instance, if I had compass plant, which is probably one of the most amazing grassland plants that was here long before we were here. If I had that plant on our property and we had hundreds of them, let's say, ideally what I would do is try to sustain that plant forever into the future. And you do that through adaptive thought
Right.
processes, you know?
You're not going to graze the same year after year.
Not the same, not as hard
Mhm.
some years, not as light some years. Trying
It's
to...
by observation.
Exactly. Trying to engage the seed bank from that species, trying to engage that species to grow, to get healthier and more productive. That's the same with any species on this property. If for instance, we have a ton of perennial rye on our property. I want to start to reduce its vigor so that I can get more species to develop in those paddocks. So what I do is I put the animals on there harder to reduce the overstory growth that it has. You would get some seed down in there or access the seed bank that's already in there. And then we get more diversity through that adaptive managed grazing.
Yeah, so that's, I think, one of the key points of regenerative ag is we practice, and there's others too, many others. It's a growing movement, which is fantastic because one of the obviously biggest, in my opinion, one of the biggest environmental impacts that humans can do, with the least input.
Well, and
is observing your land. You don't do the same thing year after year. So that means here in Wisconsin, like I could say, I move my animals and I'll move them to a paddock, they graze it, they trample it, they poop and pee on it, all the good stuff happens, and then they move off, and all that life just comes back and restores. Yeah. And I give it maybe a 35-40 day rest, some places longer, but I'm just saying, say I do that on my pasture based on the plants I have there. Maybe it's mainly grasses and legumes. And they grow up, and I graze them off. Not all of them, but once again, I move the animals through. That may not work the next state over. It everywhere looks different.
That's right.
So the definition is learning the soil, the plants where you are, and using animals adaptively to that, and moving them. Some years you're like, I can't graze this. I need to let this have more rest, maybe.
Right.
But in general, you get more and more production, and you're able to grow more while still adding the soil. Right. Diversifying species of grass and having a beautiful landscape while you're at it.
Yeah.
And it holds the soil. You don't have this Mississippi River Delta that keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger, right. Dead zones and...
Yeah, it's going to be coming at it from a different point of
Absolutely,
view. And you and I are going to have different ways of grazing and managing grazing, and each of us is going to learn to, and we're going to learn to utilize these slate of tools that are really important through educating each other and through learning through other operations and whatever. So I think that's huge. But in terms of predators, I mean, this is this is a very contentious point amongst ranchers and grazers all over the country. If you look at it, we eliminated the grizzly bear in the Great Plains grizzly bear, or we eliminated the wolf in all of the southern, whatever amount of states, and we've eliminated, and we did that because of this agricultural practices. But in my opinion, as an somebody who really believes in the study of ecology or and really loves biology, and I think that's one thing that we need to rectify. I think that is one thing that we need to understand and come to some sort of balance with the ecological system. I think one thing that George Monbiot is talking about, the guy that read that article, is he wants to rewild as much property as possible, and then do everything else vegetarian through either agricultural practices similar to the ones that we've discussed, like multi-species cover crops and things like that. And then he wants to rewild huge amounts of land. And look, it would be amazing if all of a sudden we took from Kansas to the Rocky Mountains and rewilded that from north to south, and we had huge buffalo
Right.
populations. That is very hard to do.
Right, it's a nice idea.
Well, and
Yeah.
scalability of what we're talking about versus scalability of what he's talking about, you're talking about just a completely different. I mean, I've been doing restoration ecology. We've been trying to rewild areas for since I started this. It's like, and there is room for that, and I think it's very important that we do some of that. I think that in terms of re-harnessing buffalo and but you have to get predators out on that as well. The
Or they go crazy. Yeah.
You find out in Yellowstone how when the wolves were gone and the elk were able to feed continuously along the river stream banks, because that's where wolves would have hunted most often. They eliminated tons of species, started causing erosion problems and major influx. And then as soon as you return the wolf,
they balance each other out. Once again, it's diversity of species. You can't just have one of something.
You need those elk moving on a tight pattern over a landscape together.
And the wolves keep them tight.
Exactly.
Yeah, so that's the one thing about grazing animals versus predators, is that grazing animals had to survive by moving in big groups.
Yeah.
And obviously when they move into an area, they're going to smash it all flat, so they have to move again. And they're not going to come back there for a while because there's nothing there. They smashed it all.
That's right.
And grazed it all, so they move. And
so that
is kind of what we model our grazing after.
Exactly.
Is moving in a group. Except we do it with, we don't turn predators out into our pasture to move our animals.
Predators.
We, as humans, we're kind of the predators.
We are.
So we just move the animals. We give them a fantastic life, low stress, as much as our ability. And we're still obviously learning on that too. But move them around, give that land the recovery time, and it returns it. So it is actually. It is crude in some of the Guardian article references regenerative ag as being a terrible or a crude mimicry of nature. People say they're trying to mimic nature. Well, no, we can't do it exactly like nature, but that is what we're modeling after. It's not a rebranding of just continuous grazing. It's completely different. And you have to realize, from the viewpoint, just looking...
Yeah, I would say that his imagination in this all is pretty limited.
Yeah.
What I mean by that is that, if we're talking about carbon sequestration, if we're talking about restoring the water cycle, if we're talking about losing erosion, and we're talking about food production, then we should be talking about this on a huge scale. It would be amazing if I could get 10 of these farmers to all think the same way. We use all of those animals to move over this whole area, and because scale is
that's
helpful.
how you feed, and you can
helpful to engage that biodiversity even more. The bigger the scale, the more biodiversity you can gauge. So I just think his imagining of it is ill-refined. You're basically saying that I do not like our meat production in general is bad, so therefore we should eliminate all of meat production. But what if we had a system? I mean, say we did have buffalo running from north to south, from Kansas to Colorado, and do you think that there would be no meat eating in that process?
Yeah.
I mean, even if humans decided not to eat that meat, do you think that there wouldn't be huge herds of carnivore?
Well, part of life is death. You cannot have life without death. That's kind of part of the story.
They're starting to define that even certain plants have 20 senses, 20 different senses. So it's what Dr. Fred Provenza said is my favorite way of putting it is that, look, even plants, animals have senses, but we should look at all of eating food as a spiritual undertaking. Even if you're eating say broccoli.
Yeah.
That's annual plant.
It's a life form.
Yeah,
it
exactly.
maybe isn't as complex that we know of as a cow or a sheep.
Well, and if you eliminate humans from the whole idea of eating meat, something else is going to be eating meat. I mean,
Right.
there's no stopping that. If you took these cows, all of the cows in the nation, and let them go and be free, and
Sounds like
to
a disaster.
rewild. Well, at first it would be a disaster because they would go and they would disrupt. They would have no natural predators. They wouldn't have any major. So they would do the same thing that the elk were doing in Yellowstone, depleting these riverside beds and causing all sorts of erosion
rivers,
damage. And if you were to. And then eventually a predator would move in that would be able to start tightly grazing them and start tightly moving them, and then it would
just take a few years, more than a few years probably, to balance out, probably hundreds of years.
like 300 years,
Yeah, to balance that out. And so what we're working with is, we kind of have to work with what we have, which we can make incredible changes over a fairly short amount of time. Like you actually can. There's people in 10 to 15 years, like Gabe Brown, have reversed 200 years of damage to his farm. Like in just 10 to 15, it really is possible to reverse the ecological negative impact of terrible farming practices.
A lot of those guys.
And it's, I want to make sure, in talking about these terrible farming practices, that it's not like we're slamming farmers. They're our friends. We all, they're doing, many of them are doing their best to make a living from the land. It's a lot of people reference farmers as salt of the earth. But unfortunately, we've developed, partly under the pressure from big ag salesmen and the fertilizer and chemical co-ops. You have companies like Monsanto that was bought out by. Can't think of the name of the company. Anyway, the parent company. But whatever, these farmers aren't making as many of their own decisions as they should be on what to do with their land because of financial concerns. In this area, we have farmers losing their farms that was inherited because they've had to remortgage. Like farming isn't sustainable right now. People are losing their farms. It's not sustainable. On the flip side of that, so economical sustainability of regenerative ag, people you just can't feed the world with that. I mean, you hear people say that all the time. Like, okay, so you want biodiversity, let's pull the animals off the land. That false idea of pulling animals off the land. The Guardian article says, one study, to truly get biodiversity back, you're going to have like one sheep per 40 acres or something. So meat is only, in the proper model of biodiversity, you're going to have meat that is only affordable by millionaires, which is so not true. I mean, if you can, and I know you've studied this, Alejandro Carrillo, and his farm, 30,000 acres?
Yeah.
He went to regenerative practices. He's in an area in Mexico where there's...
Chihuahua desert.
Yeah, it's desert, basically. I don't know what the stocking density is there. It probably says in the case study, but it's nothing like here. Here we can
one animal per 160 acres.
Right. It's the stocking density is insanely low compared to here. So that's why I said everywhere you are, it's going to be completely different.
But if you look at New Mexico, it was grass to the saddle when we first.
So New Mexico used to not be desert,
grassland.
right? It used to be grassland. And that was that's from continuous grazing, is how that it eliminates those species.
Or elimination of grazers.
Or elimination of grazers altogether.
Yeah.
Look, Alan Savory, you can look at his TED Talk, and he describes his work in Africa, in sub-Saharan Africa, and how they're recovering desert that he helped create in the past.
Yeah.
But anyway, he has reduced his inputs. This rancher from Mexico, where they get 8 inches of rain. They're actually having drier years more recently. They did have over the last 100 years like 10 inches of rain on average a year. But they're going down now. I just read in the case study, I think he's at 8 inches a year maybe of rain. So that's nothing. Here we have 48, 50 inches of rain a year or something. And his ranch produces 3 times the beef anybody in his area, and 3 times what he used to produce before employing regenerative practices. He is not doing near the inputs. He saved, it may have been another farm I was looking at. I think it was his. The amount, the money, it was over $200,000, I think, in this, of inputs that now he's not inputting. That may have been a different farm I was looking at. But basically, the story is the same from farm to farm. You go to regenerative practices of adaptive grazing, putting your animals together, moving them, rest periods.
Right.
Versus just turning the animals out there for the whole grazing season.
Yeah, he's doing 360 days of rest on some of his pastures.
Yeah, so his, because of that rainfall, you need a lot longer rest time. And then he moves them on through. But the point of economical sustainability is that now this ranch, he's changing his grazing practices. He's saving probably hundreds of thousands of dollars in inputs
and he's got
of minerals.
Grass again.
And he is producing 3 times the amount of beef. And he has... he's got grass.
Anecdotally, he's changed his weather patterns in that region. Because 30,000 acres is pretty big.
Right, I think that's the one that Ray Archuleta was going down to study. I think it maybe in the next Kiss the Ground film or something. But that he'll have rain events on his farm. Because he's farming, 30,000 acres. So it's huge. It actually can interface with the atmosphere. And he'll have rain events on his farm that miss the neighbors over and over and over. Yeah. And that, once again, is something that they're studying. The results aren't out on that. That's an anecdotal just observation.
Right.
But he has a thriving oasis where there wasn't one before.
That's right.
That's the point, is that this wasn't an oasis, like oasis in the desert somewhere. This was just like all the land around, and he started using regenerative agriculture. And contrary to... some environmentalists that believe that animals are the problem.
Which was always the...
That's
been an ongoing... Because animals...
can be the problem. Very much they can be the problem. If they're managed wrong. Managing is the key. But yes, they created this beautiful place down there that's producing tons of beef. Biodiversity coming back. All the positives. Right. With none of the negatives. Right. Other than if you truly don't want to kill animals. I mean, there's a place that if you feel like you can't eat animals for other reasons other than environmental impact, say you don't want to take the life of an animal or whatever, that's for you, that's fine. I won't. That doesn't take care of that, but...
Well, and I would just also like to point out, like, all of these grasslands exist because there's not enough... Most of the grasslands exist because there's not enough rain to have a forested area. You can't grow a huge, beautiful forest without a lot more rain than what these guys are getting. And so grasslands exist for that reason. And so a healthy grassland needs a healthy grazing population moving over it to continue to move those nutrients and shuffle up the ground and trample in order for a grassland to be healthy. I mean, Alan Savory does it's an interesting bit where he talks about, he looks back at the pictures of Yellowstone from the time we started managing it as a national park to the time now, and how it's slowly been desertifying. Mm-hmm. There is almost no grazers on Yellowstone. I mean, there's buffalo, but what is it, like 1,000 buffalo over... I don't know. 10,000 acres. I mean, what we're seeing is that without those grazers on grasslands, you can't have healthy grasslands. So the reality is that if you want to continue to push back on desertification, you need to have healthy ecological systems.
So not all grazing, pasture-raised meat is the same. So what's the difference between conventional grazing, where you see, most of the cows, 90% of animals are out on, pasture. What's the difference between that and adaptive, managed,
grazing,
regenerative agriculture grazing?
There's, well, first of all, there's a bunch of different terms out there right now.
Right.
Like mob grazing, adaptive,
that are confusing, grazing. Can be very confusing.
Holistic grazing, which is on Savory's point, and then there's also intensive managed grazing. So, and most of those you can kind of group together. And then there's conventional grazing, which is, so conventional grazing, in my opinion, is just basically like, okay, you have 100 acres of grazing land, it's all fenced in, maybe you have it in 2 or 3, 5 paddocks, and you put your animals out for a month at a time. You just, basically just, you know, go out there, eat whatever, and oftentimes, I mean, we have a farm right over here that's a huge operation, and they're feeding their animals almost all summer.
They feed grain.
And bales.
And bales, but
bales.
They're not surviving off the land locally. Yeah.
Whereas in my system, what I'm doing is I move the animals, our pigs, our goats, every single day. They get moved onto a new paddock, which is trampling a third, leaving a third, eating a third, basically, is the goal of
the
that.
general, yeah.
And then that piece of property does not get touched again for sometimes 30, 60, 90 days, depending on the growing season. Like in the spring,
it's growing quickly.
You're growing quickly, so you're moving quickly. And then in the summer, you're growing slowly, so you're moving slowly. And then even greater than that, if I want to engage or allow for seeding of certain species, sometimes I'll leave it for 120 days or even a whole year if I want a lot of rest. So what I'm doing is allowing for those plant species to, for one, to regenerate. Two is I'm never putting my animals on their own poop over and over and over again, so that we're dealing with parasites and all the different things that you have to, inevitably, if you're doing that on a conventional system, you have to start using pesticides to kill.
And antiparasitics and all those inputs.
Which are systemic, and then they come out the back end, and then they go into your soil system. And that kills even more biological diversity within a system. So with amp grazing or holistic grazing, your objective is to let the land heal every single time and get it back so that when you run the animals over the next time, you're putting down that compost, you're putting down manure, you're putting down urine, and then you're removing them, and then the plants get this whole opportunity to recover, put down deeper root systems. You get more biological diversity because you're getting a lot of, all that gut biome that's coming through the animal. If it's in a healthy condition, it's actually engaging more biological diversity in the soil. But also, the objective of amp grazing is to engage biodiversity in the plant species, to really help through the foot trampling and the opening up a little bit to allow new seeds and new varieties of species to come up. You can add those species, or you can just wait until the natural seed bank starts to kick in on its own. And then finally, really, one of the biggest points for me is that water cycle. Because of those root systems digging deeper, because of the compost, because of the trampling effect, you're getting much more tight density of growth of plants and very little compaction of the soil. So if you put an animal on a conventional agricultural for a month, and you say you put 100 animals over 100 acres. What happens is those animals go in there, they move all around, they eat all their best favorite things, they move all around again, they eat all the next favorite things, they do that over and over and over again.
So that plant never has a chance to recover.
And then that causes for really hard compacted soil. And that hard compacted soil leads to less resilience in those plant species. And then what you get is this major runoff events. You get a lot of weed species that start to move in because those animals are constantly causing open and bare ground because they're going back to their feeder, which is causing a lot of open bare ground, or going back to their water, which is causing open and bare ground. The what we call in natural resources is desire lines. You create desire lines where the animals are walking to and from a space continuously. You would have had that at like old salt licks for buffalo, back in the day, but not in a negative, not as negative of an impact.
Right.
So what we're trying to do is eliminate all those bare spots, get as much density of different forbs and grasses growing and regrowing, digging deeper root systems, holding more carbon, composting by pushing plants over and laying them down on the ground, and then which inevitably starts aerate your soil and fluff up your soil.
So you're working here with land that's been, fairly depleted through years of farming, continuous grazing. I don't know what kind of tillage happened. Kind of the same way. I mean, on my farm specifically, I've got some multiple different types of ground. Some that was tilled, hayed, corn, soybeans for years and years.
Yeah.
Some which was in CRP, the Conservation Reserve Program, which is kind of cool. That's where my pigs are. And for like 20 or 30 years that it was in the CRP. So you're looking for a compass plant and these prairie grasses here on your property, and over there where my pigs are, I've got all these species. And so I've been grazing the pigs and sheep on that property now for the past 2 years. I've had them there. This is the second year. And the way I manage the pigs on that property, and I'm still learning. I'm a relatively new farmer, and I haven't studied it near as much as you have as far as the ecology side of things. I just got fascinated with farming, with mainly from a nutritional aspect of the whole community of living things, from the soil to the food we eat, and how it affects our health. And that just led from one thing to the other until you realize how mind-blowing some of the stuff is that happens when you rotate animals across the land and give proper rest times and adapt to whatever the soil and climate ecology of an area is. So with the pigs, I move them. It depends on the size of the paddock I have them in. I've had some time constraints because I still am working a full-time job as well as farming. So I'm looking to get better, potentially move more frequently, manage basically tighter with what I'm doing. But currently with the pigs, which is my biggest operation, is moving around every week to 2 weeks on areas, and then they rest for a whole year.
Right.
So last year, the places I grazed the pigs last year, I haven't touched with pigs this year.
Right.
And they are full of all the species that were there before. The prairie grass, including some new ones that weren't there before. There's some that I've seeded in just to, fill in, because, pigs will disturb the soil, so I'll cover it with something like an annual or something until the other forages come back. Which that disturbance, interestingly, if you lightly disturb the soil with pigs, not plow it deep, tearing up all the soil, those are consistently the parts of my farm that produce the best in subsequent years, are spots that the pigs went over and disturbed.
Yeah.
You'll see new plants coming up that you didn't see before because they basically stimulate the seed bank. And you'd think, pigs are going to destroy that. I've had people tell me all the time, pigs are going to destroy this beautiful, piece of land. And then next time they see it, they're like, wow, that looks amazing out there. I'm like, yeah, that's where the pigs were. Like, yeah, if I leave them on there endlessly, they wear it down, and you don't get that recovery, and eventually the plant completely dies out.
That's right.
But if you hit it, they stir it up, they poop and pee on it, they fertilize, and it comes back, and you never know there were pigs in the area where they were last year. I've got compost plant growing there, all these deep-rooted
Yeah.
plants.
One of the best woodlands that I know around here in the 70s was a multi-paddock grazed pig woodland that has more biodiversity in it than any woodland that I've seen in this region. It's in terms of spring ephemerals, I'm not sure if you know that they're the most beautiful plants that only come up before the leaves on the trees.
I see, it's that first green layer.
Yes, yeah. With like trilliums and mayaples and wild leeks and
I know what those are. I just didn't.
Trout lilies, spring ephemerals. They're there for a very short period of time and they disappear. Nature inherently has ways of disturbing itself and healing itself quickly. You have annuals, biennials, and perennials for a reason. Annuals come in really quickly after disturbance. Biennials also come quickly after disturbance.
To cover the ground. It's all in the goal of covering the ground. Exposed ground is not a good thing.
So it's not a good thing, but it's also not a bad thing if done without too much.
I should say continuous exposed ground is a bad thing.
Yeah, thinking about it in terms of this disturbance ritual, like Native Americans would have burned. Let's say you want to get a better blueberry harvest. So Native Americans would have come through an area and burned an area in order to stimulate new growth on blueberries, and within 2 years you get a much better blueberry harvest because of that stimulation. That's the same with grazers. You move grazers over. So let's say you have grass that's waist high, and you move a grazing herd through there quickly and tightly, and they knock everything down. Within, if you get a little bit of light rain or even have a really good carbon-rich soil, that the regeneration that is going to be immense, and it's going to be very much more productive than if you just allow that piece of ground to sit for years and years. That study where he talks about how when you remove grazers you get greater biodiversity. Yeah, immediately you get greater biodiversity, but over time you start to lose biodiversity.
You're going to need some type of a grazer in there. They're part of the way the cycle works.
I've done restorations where we've hand collected 230 species of plants. And originally when we seeded all of those plants in the first 2 years, we had 230 species. But as the property develops without any other disturbance regime, you start to lose biodiversity. So what happens is you take those cows off, and immediately you get a ton of biodiversity, right? There's a lot of species that are able to come in. But then after 5-10 years, then your invasive species like buckthorn, honeysuckle, multiflora rose, they all start to take over and really reduce biodiversity in an immense way.
And I've got some of that coming on that property that was in CRP.
Yeah.
That's what I need to work on, taking some of that down to allow, because it tends to take over.
But if you look at your CRP land, you have probably 150 species out there of different plants. It's the perfect model for what we're talking about. Taking old CRP land and turning it into grazing land, and then utilizing the timing to engage more biodiversity is totally. I mean, like this field, we have a field down here that was all corn and soybeans for a long time, and then she turned it into grazing. Super low biodiversity because they did all of the tilling and whatever. And, in order for me to really regain a huge amount of biodiversity, I need to add species. But adding species, I could add species to a grass, a cool season grass mix that are almost all of these cool season grasses that we're looking at today that are in your yard, yada, yada. They're all from Europe or Eurasia or, Africa, whatever, from other places. So if I was to take a whole bunch of native seeds and just drop them in there, I'd probably see some of them come up from seed. But
a lot of them are going to be out-competed.
Very low. But if I take that same piece of property and I spread a whole bunch of native seeds, and then I move animals through that property to reduce the overstory cover, to create more compost, to engage the microbiota, then all of a sudden I'm going to see a heck of a lot more of those species start to germinate and come up and see through. You can in restoration ecology, it takes 5 to 7 years for you to actually to restore a piece of property. But then it could take, if you don't touch that for another 5 to 7 years, you're probably going to lose it again.
So in other words,
Wendell Berry says this.
Yeah.
Wendell Berry talks about how nature abhors a vacuum.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a lot of people these days who go out and buy a big piece of property, and they're like, well, we're just going to let it go back to nature, right? What does that mean?
And they sit there watching it go into crap, basically.
Dilapidate into buckthorn, honeysuckle.
Yeah.
You lose your oak regeneration. You lose without some sort of disturbance regime, which are
grazing animals,
or fire, or you know, all of these things. You can't manage that. Mm-hmm. It will dilapidate into its least healthy state over time.
There are some wild areas, but once again, we talk about wild areas that are truly wild, such as the old West or the Midwest, where you had predators and grazing animals.
Yeah.
They were managing the land in essence.
Yeah,
they didn't have, we have all these wildfire issues also nowadays because we've kept fire away for so long out west with, Smokey the Bear campaigns and all that stuff. And suddenly we have fires that take off and they're so bad.
They're so hot.
They're so hot
that
because
they burn
there's
the seed bank below the ground.
Right. In other words, these are fires that are different than yesteryear because there's been so much buildup of all this fuel. So in other words,
what would have reduced that fuel?
So there are some wild, undisturbed ecosystems, or undisturbed, I should say, by humans, that work fairly well. But just taking a piece of land and saying, "Oh, we're going to leave it wild." Well, what do you mean by wild?
Well, and I would say that there is no ecosystem
that can be truly wild.
That is actually healthy based on. Because you've eliminated the keystone grazers. That you've eliminated
so we don't have the huge herds of buffalo and the mastodons. And
there's nothing. There's nothing. If you're looking at the dilapidation of the soil, that's obviously due to farming. But if you take a wild area and you say that it's in there are coniferous forests north of here, whatever. But there was also wood buffalo in those places at some point in time. And there was fire regimes that actually, you can look at, like, the boundary waters of Minnesota. Uh-huh. There's research showing that fire was a hugely important factor to engage in biodiversity. If you look at the sands, the sand barrens of the East Coast, there's so little biodiversity in there anymore. When before humans really, before Europeans came here and stopped allowing for fire in those regimes, you would have had huge diversity. I mean, like I worked with the Carner blue butterfly and the lupin, wild lupin. Yeah. You drive down through South Carolina and North Carolina and Virginia and all those sandy pine tree areas. Yeah. There would have been amazingly beautiful wildflowers, from blazing star to wild lupin to goat's rue to, New Jersey tea, and you virtually don't see those at all. Right. And you know where you see them at? Is along power line cuts, where they're cutting the tree, opening up the tree layer and allowing for stuff to come in, and railroad corridors. Those are your most diverse locations in all of those places. And
because they periodically come through, disturb and cut, and then the rest of the time it's left to rest.
Create disturbance and create
then rest.
Opening and then rest. Yeah. And so you're allowing for that seed bank to germinate. If you're just allowing for all of the pine, just straight pine trees, then all you get is a very low diverse forb and grass layer, and you get a ton of pitch pine, Virginia pine, whatever, So, disturbance is part of the system, and you have to have that in order to create the biodiversity. And the biodiversity is directly correlated to how much carbon that is being sequestered, the microbiota, the diversity of the mushroom, the bacteria species,
livestock has a huge impact. This discussion is just a scratch on the surface of the animal diversity there is from bacteria, or I should say organism diversity, from bacteria to mycelium under the soil. All that is reliant on one of the keystone animal species, which is grazing animals. So in other words, looking at the environment and looking at the future for our kids and for farming is like really important. It's actually a building block. Like we have to manage animals on the land or we'll lose it.
Well,
currently where we're at, but it has to be done right. So in other words, yes, the statement is true that farming is probably one of the most damaging things, and pasture-based farming is probably one of the most damaging things in modern history.
Right.
Yes, you have factories, yes, you have all that, but farming covers way more than that, doesn't it? It's been tearing down and tearing down and tearing down. They're ripping up the soil over and over, year after year, and spraying. But the answer to that is also farming.
Yeah.
It's just a different description of farming.
Well,
it's farming.
It's stewardship.
Stewardship of instead of treating the land. It's turning it from an extractive industry to something that you're actually managing to build, and that's why the term regenerative agriculture is because you're regenerating it by supporting and managing the natural processes that cause nature to rebuild itself and heal. Those processes are there. We've just been treating nature as the enemy, fighting back with sprays, with plows. Like we're fighting every bit of nature, the thistles, like all this. It's like a fight until you back up and reset and realize that, nature's bigger than us.
Yeah.
They're going to win. That's why farmers are losing right now, is because the inputs have gotten so high, so much inputs. We're losing. So in other words, we need to back up and see how we can manage the processes that are already there and rebuild, which rebuilding is possible. Like I said, the ranch, down there, the 30,000 acres in Mexico, Gabe Brown's ranch in North Dakota, White Oak Pastures in Georgia, I believe. These are just some bigger names.
Yeah.
Down to smaller farms. I manage 63 acres. I don't own any of it. It's all leased parcels of land.
That's right.
But I'm just stewarding it.
Well, and that brings back another point about conventional farming is that oftentimes at this point conventional farming is based around, it's a rental. You might have your farm and it might be 1,000 acres, but generally if you're buying the tractor and you're buying all the equipment, you're farming a bunch of other people's property, and by proxy you've come to the point where it's all about making an income, and for sure as a farmer you need to make an income in order to survive. But these guys are running thousands of acres and could care, or oftentimes care, and I don't mean to broadly stroke this, but the point of it for them is to make sure that there's no weeds and that there's great amount of production. And so what they're doing is they're putting in inorganic nitrogen and lots of petrochemicals in order to get to that point, and could care less what's running off or whatever, because at the end of the day, if that property starts to become unproductive to them, they're only renting it. They don't care whether or not.
Right. And I'm renting the property that I use too, but I do have a view of it that
a stewardship
it's stewardship. It's the future. Like I can't just do this and walk off. Like what other planet am I going to go to? So currently we don't know of any others that we can move to when we destroy this one.
Exactly.
So, but it can regenerate. It can sustain way more than it sustains right now. Like our population is only feeling overpopulated because we're crapping on everything. Like it's whatever. It's
well, and that's the other really good point is that at this point in our relationship with this planet, management is paramount to the
Key.
success of
Right.
our... And you have to manage the habitat.
Not,
you have
not
to
stopping
think about
using it, but by managing it.
Yes.
So because you can manage it to make it more productive.
And evolutionarily, if you look at almost all of the species of every grassland were managed by grazers and possibly a little bit of fire forever. And so evolutionarily, each one of these species is adapted and naturally adapted to grazing processes.